How many of us here could name the 12 disciples? Who could name them? Just at standing start. Who could name the 12? And put your hand up if you think you could name them. So I tried it, obviously without cheeking. I tried it and I got 10, so I couldn't name them. It's amazing how few people actually remember the names of the people who were the closest friends to the most famous person who ever lived. But we don't know much about them. You just get a name check, and that's kind of all we know. When I was growing up, when I was wee and growing up in church, there was only 3 disciples I knew anything about. There was a guy called Peter, and I remembered him. He was a fisherman, and he seemed to be like the leader of the disciples. And then there was Judas Iscariot, and he was a terrible guy. He was the one that betrayed Jesus and got Jesus into trouble. And the third one was Thomas. And Thomas was a bit second-rate because he didn't have very much faith compared to the other disciples. For some reason, I remembered that. In this series that the church are going through, where it's called The Unravelled, and in this particular Sunday, we've been asked to think about Thomas. It turns out Thomas had a nickname, and he was called the Twin. Now, I don't know, I can't be sure, but I've got a crazy idea. Maybe he was called the Twin because he was a twin. So, I think I might be in solid ground here. Maybe that's why they called him the Twin. We can't be sure, because nobody knows who his twin was. But maybe that's why they called him the Twin. But I can assure you that the Twin is not the name we use for Thomas anymore. Because all down through the years, and it's even got into the English language, doubting Thomas is the expression we use for him. And it's usually meant as a bit of a criticism. And the label is unfair, not because Thomas didn't doubt, but because after the events of Easter time, every single one of the disciples doubted what had happened. It wasn't that highly unlikely story that convinced all the rest of them. It was because they met Jesus. They actually encountered him, and that's what convinced them. And when that happened, Thomas wasn't there. He wasn't with them. And it took him a few days later before he had the chance to meet with Jesus. And if, instead of Thomas, it had been a different disciple who hadn't been there, you can be sure they would have had the same reaction, as would we. What we do know about him is that eventually he ended up taking the message of the gospel as far as India. And apparently, even to this day, there are people in India who call themselves St. Thomas Christians. And they're part of churches that trace themselves, their origins, right back to communities in India that Thomas himself founded all those years ago. And they don't define Thomas by his faults or by his doubts. They see Thomas as the one who brought the message of Jesus to them. So, it seems for most of us, Thomas gets a bit of a bad rap because of his name, the Doubting One. But the Unravelled series, people, they reckon it's important to think about doubt at church and to know that doubt is a very big element in everybody's life. And when it comes to our faith, doubt is something we need to confront and try and work through, just like Thomas. Many of you will know that things have been very tough for my family over these last months. I could give you a list, and that would take ages, but let me just mention one thing. Let me just mention some other twins. My son Robbie and Amy had twins on May the 16th, but they were born prematurely at 23 weeks. Since then, Robbie and Amy have spent every single day at some point at hospital. And that situation will continue right up to September, when the twins were supposed to be born. Noah has had a lot of trouble, infections to contend with. Because of a blood clot, he's already lost fingers in his left hand, but he's slowly making progress recently. Unfortunately, his twin sister Ava, his wee sister, she died at just under 5 weeks. And a funeral was arranged for July the 2nd, and the funeral had to be postponed because at that time Noah was dangerously ill. So a new date was set for the 26th of July, and that's when that funeral happened. And at the funeral, I was in the very unenviable position of being a minister, but also Ava's grandpa. And I had to think what on earth I would say to people on that day. And so I decided to speak about one of my doubts and to be open about my doubts, not as a way to make the situation even more gloomy, but actually as a way to express hope. You see, sometimes doubts point us to comfort rather than more despair. Doubts are often pointers to the fact that we've got something wrong and we need to adjust our view of God. Doubts are not just inevitable, sometimes they are necessary to get to the truth. So, I said at the funeral that I'd been a minister nearly all my adult life. And one of the interesting things you can get up to when you're a minister, well, anyone can do it, but maybe if you're a minister, more likely to. One of the interesting things is asking yourself serious questions about things you've been told or asked to believe. And over the years, I've done that, and I've asked my questions, and my questions have changed me, slowly. I don't believe all the things that I used to believe. And I think that some of the things that the church has told the world about God are not helpful. So I've changed quite a bit. I think differently now. Our faith is not just about the things we believe. It also includes the things we don't believe. And what we don't believe can be just as vital for getting through life. Well, after all this time, I do still believe. But I don't believe that God plays favourites. I don't believe that God can make sure that certain people are free from trouble, the kind of trouble that might strike somebody else. We live in a crazy world. It's all mixed up. And there's joy and there's pain. And there's wonder and beauty and adventure. And there's hurt and accident and misfortune. And nobody is immune from trouble and tragedy. And of course, some people get more than their fair share. Things are not even. This is not an even world. This is a random world. Now, if God can just snap some fingers to prevent what happened to baby Ava, then why didn't God do that? In order to make God seem as great as possible, people of faith often have made claims about God, such as, God can do anything. God is so powerful, they say. There is nothing that God cannot do. And that sounds wonderful. But clearly it's not true. If God can do anything, then why doesn't God jump in to stop tragedies and mishaps from taking place? In fact, why doesn't God just stop anything bad ever happening? Way back in Bible times, people believed God was behind everything. If it rained, or it snowed, or the sun came out, God was just pressing some buttons or turning some switches. God was turning on the weather. And it was believed that in this life, God gave everyone what they deserved. So if you lived a long life, God was pleased with you. If you had a short life, not so much. If you were poor, if you were disabled, you were being punished. If you were rich, if you were successful, you were clearly a good person. And if you did good, God would reward you in this life. And if you did bad, God would punish you in this life. So the basic belief was God micromanaged everything that went on in the world. Why did people ever think like that? Why did they ever think these things? Because they had no other way of accounting for events. People had no idea about weather systems, or about germs, or about infections, for example. And even today, for some Christians, there's a feeling that it's good to suggest that God can do anything, which means that God could stop accidents, disasters, terrorist activities, right down to you breaking your legs, or stopping you from catching COVID, or helping you to find a parking place at Tesco. And it's just not true. And claiming things that are just not true, especially when attributing them to God, is a very bad thing to do. And it's responsible for putting people off thinking about Christianity seriously. Imagine if it was true. Imagine God had the power to stop accidents and the power to stop any trouble happening, and then not using that power. What kind of God would not use that power? There's so much wonderful that goes on in the world. There's so much that's good in the world. But there's so much sadness and pain as well. Can you believe a God of love is looking at our situation in the world right now and saying, that's brilliant. The world is exactly as I want it. Great stuff. I'm quite happy with the overall level of suffering in the world. That's fine, says God. Really, if there is a God like that, that God is not a God of love. So here's what I believe, that God doesn't play favourites. This world is random and unfair. But if we accept that to be true, it still leaves us with a very good question. If God doesn't intervene to stop bad things happening, what good is God? Why believe in God? What's the point of God if God can't actually do anything? Well, I don't believe that God can stop bad things happening to you or to me or to the people we love. But I didn't say that God can't intervene, because God can and God does intervene. I believe that God intervenes in the short term, and I believe that God intervenes in the long term. In the short term, God stands with us, and God feels our pain too. And God offers to be with us, to support us, and help us get through whatever it is to the other side. God offers us, in the short term, resources to help us that we maybe didn't even know we had. We discover things like courage and patience and hope and strength and love. And many of us will have experienced this in our own situations. And in the long term, in the big term, God promises that ultimately death will not be the end. Every person's life, earthly life, has got a beginning and an ending. But some people don't have much of a middle. Eva lived for almost 5 weeks. She never really came to full consciousness. And I'm sorry, but 5 weeks doesn't seem like much of a life to me. It seems at first glance that the life God granted to Eva was hardly worth living, hardly worth bothering about. Unless life is a much greater and bigger thing than we imagine. Unless life is not just whatever happens in a few years or a few weeks on earth. And our lives are not ended at death. And that, of course, is the fact at the very heart of our faith. This is a promise that changes everything. No matter what we face in life, no matter how long or how short our life may be, we are safe with God. Nothing can separate us from God's love. Neither death nor life, neither the present nor the future. There's nothing in all creation that will ever be able to separate us from God and God's love. God says, I will never leave you. I will never abandon you. So I believe that Ava is safe with God, always will be, and that her life is continuing on, even now, in ways we can't even begin to imagine. I'd like to finish with a reading from an American author called Barbara Brown Taylor. And she's writing about an old woman that she used to visit before this old woman died. The woman was 97 when she died. She was born in 1894. And so this is what Barbara said in one of her books. She said, as she got older, her short-term memory got worse, but her long-term memory got better. And one day, as I sat by her bed, she told me about a summer's day from her childhood, where she and some of her girlfriends hitched up their long skirts and climbed Mount Washington in New Hampshire. They went too far and they stayed too long, she said. And before they knew it, the beautiful sunset they were watching had turned into a foggy dusk, so that they couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. No one had a torch. Torches hadn't been invented yet. Nobody knew for sure what was the best way to go down, but they agreed that they would all hold hands and that they would not, under any circumstance, let go of one another. And so that's how they did it. One girl at the front, picking her way down the mountain, one step at a time, and all the rest of them strung out behind her, holding onto each other's wrists, so that they made a living human chain. Every now and again, someone would want to argue about which was the best way to go, and all the others would listen, but what none of them did was let go. Sometimes my friend said, all I knew or could see of the world was the hand ahead of me and the one behind. Sometimes my arms ached so badly I thought I would cry out loud. But that is how we made it at last. We found our way home by holding on to one another. It's strange to think that after a few short weeks, that Ava has already found her way home before us, and that we are all still on the journey. But that is the truth of it. We must continue our lives now, and with God's help, we will find our way home too. And one way we do that is by holding on to one another. Thanks be to God.